You're listening to We're All Gonna Die Anyway with Jess Weiner. Don't worry. This is a joyful podcast about life, death, and everything in between. Hello, I'm coming to you live from a giant paradigm shift that we are experiencing. We are now 4+ months into a safer at home quarantine because we're in the middle of a worldwide pandemic. We have experienced and are experiencing cultural unrest, and rightfully so, around the systemic violence, police brutality, and racism that so many Black Americans have been experiencing in this country for hundreds of years. We have been taking to the streets. We've been raising our voices and having conversations, difficult conversations around crumbling systems and reckoning with our privilege and where we stand in the world, and trying to figure out how to undo the systems that have been created that cause such great inequity in this country. I mean, to talk about a personal going within period, we are in it. And this guest that I have on the show today is literally one of those people I want by my side when we're in the middle of shit like this, because she is a wonderful friend, but she is a fierce protector of boundaries and self-care and spiritual love and connection. She just embodies for me grace and peace and hope and sincerity. And I do not say this lightly. When I met our guest, and I'll tell you how I did that in a minute, but when I met her, again, instant click for me. She is a sister from another mister. I adored her, and I knew I wanted to have her voice on this program. In good fashion, like most of this year has been so far, everything got turned upside down. We had a date set. We weren't able to make that happen. We were going to record here in the studio in Los Angeles, where I'm coming to you from now. And so that time didn't work out. And it turns out that she's the kind of person who would say, well, that's just divine timing. And I agree. It was divine timing, because we were able to Zoom this interview just a short while ago, and it was perfect timing to talk about all of that paradigm shift that I mentioned in the beginning, and also some great personal shifting that is happening in her life. Our guest today is a dear and wonderful friend of mine named Zuri Adele. And if you know Zuri, you may know her from Freeform's wonderful show called Good Trouble, where she plays the character Malika Williams, who is an activist actually based on real-life activist Patrisse Cullors of the Black Lives Matter movement. The show is wonderful. She's wonderful in it. Zuri, for me, as I mentioned, all those accolades in the beginning, is just the real deal. She went to Spelman College undergrad. In 2015, she graduated from UCLA with her master's, her MFA, from the Film and Television School. And not too long after graduating, she has established the Zuri Adele Scholarship Fund for HBCU students. And so if you don't know, or HBCU Alumni, if you don't know what HBCU stands for, it stands for Historically Black Colleges and Universities. She has set up a scholarship fund for those who've gone to HBCUs to then pursue their master's degree from UCLA in television and film. That is who Zuri is. She is intentional. She is smart. She is giving back to her community, and that matters quite a bit to her. I met Zuri at Freeform, actually. Freeform is one of those studios and networks that I partner with to do a lot of professional development workshops for their cast. So I do that a lot at different studios around town here in Los Angeles. I get to meet lots of performers, and talented ones at that. But when I met Zuri, there was more than just her talent there. When we were talking about things, it was at such a deep and naturally connective level that I knew that we were destined to have more of those conversations together. So we've developed a really wonderful friendship. As I mentioned, the timing just was right in so many ways for her to come on this program now. What we didn't know, of course, was that when we were talking, it would just be a very short while after she lost her father, Daryl. And she's going to talk about that on the program today. Both her parents, her mother and her father, are incredible teachers in her life. They're another wonderful example of intentional parenting. But when we talk about creating a good life, a life we love on our own terms, rooted in our own values, when you hear Zuri's story of intentionality, of spirituality, of connection to self-care and wellness, you'll understand where that legacy comes from her lovely and beautiful family. So for this program, the timing was right. The guest is even more right. I can't wait for you to meet my friend, Zuri Adele. Let's dig in. I said a little prayer before we got on together because I was like, out of all the waiting and divine timing that we've both been waiting to align to for this conversation, I'm like, who would have guessed we were going to talk in February? And I don't know. I like, this is how I feel like life is right now, where it's like every plan I had, goodbye.
Surrender.
Every thought I had about things being one way or the other, goodbye.
Yeah.
And yet all of it is reassembling, I believe, for the higher good.
The highest good.
The highest good.
Yeah. I mean, and we kept saying, we're like, the timing's going to be perfect. Something must be coming. And damn, we didn't know.
We better be careful what we say next time.
Woo! Well, all this stuff was going to come to the surface.
Yes, yeah.
So
for sure.
I'm really glad that we get to talk about it. I think if we had spoken earlier, we would have wanted to record again.
I know. I think so too. Well, and you know what's interesting is like initially we stopped down when everything stopped down and we weren't quite sure how to proceed with this and what to say. Also, like, I'm highly aware that I am looking to create a conversation around a title called "We're All Gonna Die Anyway."
Right.
Which is like perhaps like a bad title during a pandemic, and then perhaps
most appropriate.
Or most appropriate. I know. I think I'm coming around to that. I think the fear in me was like, oh my gosh, is this going to be insensitive? And then as we're progressing into the conversation now that we're having, which is, like so much bigger than the pandemic. It's a different pandemic, and it's a long lasting pandemic of racial violence. And then it's like, this means something different because this is what we're trying to stop and shift. And so just all of the systems crumbling are both, I'm like mostly exhilarated by it, but I'm terrified. I mean, I'm terrified by what is coming forward. You know how like when you can't put a Band-Aid on a gaping wound, you have to lance the wound, you have to heal all of it. And I guess the terrified part for me is less about like the fear of seeing it and more like this relief that it is being seen and knowing that it has its own energy, right?
Yeah. And it's been seen. And the thing about it now is that it's undeniable. There's no Band-Aid big enough anymore.
No, ma'am.
And we are also quarantined, and there are less things that we can like put in its place.
That's right.
Yeah. And
we're all communicating in this medium. That's the other thing. Like, the whole revolution will be televised is no joke. And so just this is the most form of communication right now is both perfect and imperfect, right? I mean, it prohibits us from actually really sometimes seeing each other as humans and really being able to, look in each other's faces and, like we said in the beginning, like kind of hug and touch and love and be with each other. And I am so grateful for the portal that it allows people to see into right now, because you can't hide from that.
Yeah, that's so true. And it's like there's so much that makes me want to shut off all technology right now, social media especially. And then there's also this reminder that there's so much to share. There's so many ways to use our powers for good, that it makes me want to stay, with boundaries. And I'm really grateful for technology. Oh my God, especially like with my father passing and being able to hold ceremony for him and celebrate him in this way. I never, ever would have thought that we were going to do that virtually. He surely never would have imagined it. And the blessing is that 400 people got to come together from all over the world and make their peace, with his transition and also celebrate him.
Yeah.
So the power of technology can be used in these powerful ways, like we're using them now. Yeah.
That's right. I know. I can't wait to talk about your papa. Hopefully we can a little bit during this
Yeah.
conversation.
Oh, absolutely. I would love to.
But what's funny is I was thinking about us finally creating this moment or having this moment created for us to come together, right?
For real. Yeah.
Was, the funny thing, like most people, actually, this is a theme in my life. I'm noticing like a lot of people that I care about deeply, I don't see as often as I would like. And a lot of our friendships or like energy gets expressed virtually or gets expressed with distance. Like,
so true.
Is it true for you also? Because we've only met once, Zuri.
I know. I can't. When I remember that, I couldn't believe it.
And we met under like not social circumstances. I came into Freeform when you guys were starting Good Trouble, doing like kind of a talent kickoff. And we talked about ways to kind of, stay intact during an amazing production like the one you were going to embark upon. Cut to, like, obviously I want to talk about that as well and the legacy that I think Good Trouble is leaving and sharing in the world. But I just, when I was preparing for this conversation, even though you and I have lots of communication via social media, I was like, I just marveled at how close I feel to you, how much closer I feel to you now in these conversations. And yet we haven't had to have yummy vegan food over this, which I'm dying to do with you.
I know, which we've been trying to do.
Or just being able to be in community. But that's the other part that made me think of your comment on technology. Like that is the magic of it, right? Is that when we connect, it's been instant. It's been around a particular moment. It's been building a friendship like virtually. And even my best friends and I mostly communicate via text and FaceTime and email, which is so weird.
Yeah. Well, and it's such a testament to the fact that, I strongly believe that we have many soulmates in many, with different purposes in our lives. And you are certainly one of mine. And it was so undeniable in the day that we met. And you also, your presence and your work, like you saying yes to your calling and what you brought to the table that day, made it so clear that Good Trouble and Freeform were divinely assigned to my life. There was so much intention about what we are here to do with our platform and what we're here to do with each other behind the scenes. And you made that really, really clear that we're using our purpose for good.
Yeah.
And that energy, like we were in such spiritual agreement that not much needed to be said to clarify that. You just know.
Yeah.
You just know when you know. And it did feel like we've known each other for lifetimes. And it's shocking that we haven't spent time in person since then.
It is weird to me just because I feel like, well, first of all, also, this is also social media, right? I think I know parts of what your home looks like or things that you're eating or your meditation rituals that I followed along with. Like, this is like the crazy part of how we get to be in each other's lives without always physically being there.
Yeah, that's so true. And texting each other and checking in on each other. Yeah, and that's so true, though. We get that inside scoop on each other's lives.
Yes. And we have very good, I always find too, when you find your kind of soulmates in the world, your people, then you also, by association, we have, wonderful people in common. And so Michael Medico, who we both know and love dearly, he also came in to speak on this program. And, Michael, I don't know if you know this, but like I met Michael at a fondue party.
Hilarious. Like, also kindred, because of course over great food.
Of course.
And fondue also, specifically.
And fondue, which is also super 70s. But I met him like before I even lived in LA. He was leaving. I was coming into a party. We sort of locked eyes and then stayed and talked the rest of the night. And it was a friendship made over 20 years ago. Like just that kind of connecting. So I deeply believe that when we do get to connect with our soul community, it is your words, it's undeniable and it's easy, actually.
It's easy.
Those
Because
little,
there are people who we can be around every day physically,
yeah,
and not be aligned,
yes,
or not necessarily be. I mean, we may all be soulmates in some way. Certainly,
yeah,
we're all teachers in each other's
for
lives.
sure.
But that like puzzle piece
Yeah,
connection is so special,
I
and it
know.
doesn't require being physically, which this pandemic is showing. It doesn't require physical proximity every time to know that that's the case.
That's an interesting point that I think out of all the philosophizing that we've done around the pandemic and what we're getting from it, that's something I've been thinking on, but I haven't really said out loud a lot, which is for me, this has been a validation of spirit, of energy, of I think for even maybe people on a different belief path of realizing that like it's not just about what you physically contribute to, like your thoughts, your behaviors, your literal the energy that you're consuming and giving
Yeah,
out has such
yeah,
a ripple effect impact on
yeah.
the world. And I think
Hmm.
we see it now because we all got grounded around the same time.
Mm, yeah.
And then it was
Hmm.
sort of like, oh, well then how do I emit love? How do I emit compassion? How do I emit empathy? Like what are the
Yeah.
ways that I do that? And then mostly I think to ourselves. I mean, I've met myself on this quarantine
Listen.
more times than I would care to admit.
Yes. Same.
Like that mirror is intense and
Hmm.
important.
Hmm. And relentless.
And relentless.
Yeah.
I know. I have so many things that I want to ask you and dig into with this. But I wanted to say one last thing about what you shared around the Freeform Good Trouble way that we worked, because I think it's why I love those moments more than anything, because if you think about your role as an artist and a storyteller in culture, most of the time in Hollywood, and I don't know if you feel this to be true, so I'd love to know how you feel about it. But I think historically, most of the time actors and their role on impact in the world were kept separate from
Mm.
that connection. And so we talked about the industry stuff and the responsibilities you have from a business standpoint, but what I loved
Mhm.
about these programs that we get to do together and that we did for Good Trouble was about you as people before as
Mhm.
actors, right? And you
Yes.
as individuals that have now a character to play. And I want to talk about Malika and the character and where that comes from, because that's what a powerful twist in this world right now.
Yeah.
Hello. But I also love that we get to start, because I think we do that right before you guys start shooting, right? Or you've already
Yeah.
maybe shot
No,
oh,
no,
you
it was
haven't
right
shot yet.
before. Yeah, that was like an orientation.
Because think about that intentionality. If performers and writers and creators were able to like ground in purpose as well as the product,
Yeah.
then you go on to create, which I think is the case for Good Trouble. You go on to be a vessel. You're creating a vessel of fun, creative, enlightening stories, but with a real purpose. And I don't mean purpose
Yeah.
capital P like everybody's talking about it. You live into it. Like it just
Yeah.
is
It just is.
what it
Yeah.
is. But I
Yeah.
love that the network gave us a space to anchor in that before you
Hmm.
commenced that work.
Oh yeah. I mean, it speaks so much to Freeform and like the purpose that they clearly have
Hmm.
taken on. And they're making sure that our cups are full and overflowing
Yeah.
before we pour out, either on set and then into the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And Freeform and Good Trouble, the Good Trouble script specifically, but also all of Freeform shows and the culture in the Freeform office. It was so clear when I was even going for auditions, how much of
Mm.
a family Freeform is, and how inclusive Freeform is, and how passionate about continuing to get better and better, about social justice, social
Yeah.
issues. They just seem to be so clear on
Yeah.
reclaiming the network and reclaiming the platform that the network has. But they knew that the importance is to pour into each individual so that we can do it in an authentic way. And
Yeah.
they've been so passionate about making sure that each of us are authentic people. I mean, it's
Yeah.
really clear in who they hire for every role: series
Bingo.
regulars, guest stars, everybody. Behind the scenes, too, directors, everybody. I mean, people in the accounting office. Like, it's very, very intentional.
Yeah. Well, and think about it. We should probably give a shout out to Elizabeth Boykevich, who runs casting there, because, right? Because
The queen.
she is the queen. And she's also the queen of intentionality. I mean, if you want to talk about an executive who lives her purpose and then puts her purpose into her work,
Yeah.
like, she finds you. I mean, she's the one who is like, for those who are listening who don't know what a casting director does, they are literally the arbiter of bringing in people to the network for these roles. And she has a very particular belief system about humans and human beings and art and the work that we do. And so I think for her to cast both the character and like what the character needs, but what the human needs,
Yeah.
takes intentionality to that point.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We got good people out in the world. That's
Oh my
part of my
goodness.
gratitude. Um,
Yeah.
so, on this program, right, I started these series of conversations out of my own searching of wanting to talk about how many people deal with loss and grief, but
Mhm.
also life and living, like what it brings up for us to get really intentional. We've said that word a lot, but it's a good word of
Yeah.
focused commitment to a life that we wish to create. So we will talk about death and loss, but I want to talk about birth, and I want to talk about your birth. Do you know anything about your birth story? How it was for your mom, like what the experience was? Do you have any fables in your family of of you coming into the world?
I love that you start with this. Um, what I do know that my mother will never let me forget is that my mother was in labor for 23 hours because my head, something about I needed to move my head just a little bit, and it took 23 hours for that to happen.
Oh my God.
Um, that's that's mainly what I know.
Yeah. Where were you born?
I was born in Boston. I was born
Okay.
in Boston. Yeah, so that's where I lived when my parents were still married. That's where we all lived until I was about 5, and they lived
Okay.
there for a while. They were together for a long time before I was born. And so I was born in Boston, and I'm my mom and dad's only child, my stepmom's only child as well. So I got a lot of
Wow.
love. Yeah, 3 parents,
Yeah.
lots of attention.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
and yeah, that's what I know. I'm trying to
Mhm.
think if there's anything else. I mean, I'm worth the wait. That's
Well, I was gonna say, talk about intentional. You took your time. That was for
I took
sure.
my
You're like,
time.
I will turn
Yeah,
my head when I'm
when I
ready.
feel like it, okay?
Okay.
And they were so happy with what they got, they decided not to have any more. Um
Now that's a story you've been telling yourself that whole time.
it works for
It
me.
works. I
Which
love that.
it brings me back a little bit to just what we were saying about good trouble
Yeah.
and being intentional and all that, especially with Elizabeth and Freeform and you, is that there were so many doors that continued to I thought close when I was auditioning a lot for various television roles and not hearing a yes.
Hmm.
And I just say that to say that I'm so glad because that opened this huge door for me to play Malika, and I didn't even know Malika
Mhm.
was coming. And just that all of those auditions, a journey of life that
Yep.
occurred in order to prepare me to take on this role and platform at this particular time in life
I know.
was all again divinely intentional.
Yeah. It is all
Yeah.
really about divine timing,
The
isn't it?
wait, that 23 hours of labor. Yeah. Yeah, it
It's worth
really
the wait.
is.
And
And the community that I've gotten as a result.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, none of that is by accident. That I know to be sure. When you were born and you said you lived in Boston until you were about 5, where did you grow up the rest of your time?
So I grew up in Palo Alto, California for most
Oh,
of that time. Yeah, my mom got a fellowship and then a job at Stanford.
wow.
And so I grew up on Stanford's campus with my mom. And then my dad moved back to Brooklyn, New York, which is where they had lived in New York before I was born, before they moved to Boston. My mom had a job at the Boston Globe, which is what took them to
Wow.
Boston. So yeah, so then when
Wow.
I was about 5, right before kindergarten started, we moved to Palo Alto, and that's where I went to school from kindergarten through the
Oh
end of
my
high
gosh.
school. And then my parents like co-parented, across the country, and I would go to Brooklyn every school break that was at least a few days, like spring break. My dad
Yeah.
was an educator, so it was perfect because he was also
He was in
off during
alignment
those
with your
breaks.
timing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
And were your parents, they managed to co-parent very well during that time in their relationship?
Very well.
Aw.
Very well. I mean, they remained great friends. They were both
Yeah.
writers. It was so it I mostly remember them not being together because I was so
Right.
young when they divorced. So it's kind of all that I know, and my experience. Of course, I'm always curious about like what each of their experiences are and were. But my experience is that there was no drama. They both spoke so highly of each other all the time. They sent each other gifts. And we were all together when we were together. We would, if
Mm.
one parent was visiting the other city and we were all there, we were going out to dinner. My mom and my stepmom get along really well. They read the same books. They talk about them. Like, it's definitely a village. It took a
That is a
village.
huge
Yeah.
gift, Zuri. Like that really is,
Huge.
I mean,
Huge.
what a beautiful modeling of a way to be, again, intentional seems to be the theme of this convo, but as a parent, to be able to
Yeah.
show up for your child past your relationship, whatever that is, to really be
Yeah.
that role for
Yeah.
your kid.
Yeah. It's really amazing. And then what I also
That.
love is like my cousins on my mom's side are very close with my dad. Like, they call him Uncle
Mm.
Daryl. Like, my cousins on my dad's side very close with my mom. My cousins and uncles and aunts on my stepmom's side of the family, everybody is one big family. I mean, because some of them live in the same cities,
Yeah.
and you can't always even tell who's blood related to
Mm.
whom, and they go to each other's houses, and it's just one big. Everyone calls each other in-laws, and we're all.
I
It
love that.
really is, and it's my normal. So I forget sometimes how until I witness drama and other families, especially now, like having friends who have children,
Yep.
and yeah, like seeing either the drama or seeing a lack of drama and being like, oh yeah, that's familiar to my upbringing. I
Yeah.
love being a product of that type of environment. I'm so grateful.
I love hearing about that too. It's why I start with the birth story, because there's always some twist in that for everybody, because
Yeah.
where they were born, how they were born. When I think about your childhood, I wonder if you could reflect on it and think about, how would you describe it in 3 words, like the first 3 words that come to your mind, your childhood in Palo Alto. What would those be?
Oh, well, okay. I have to say that when I think about it, I think about this combo of like Palo Alto and Brooklyn and
Okay,
Boston.
great.
So I hear drum circles.
Mm,
There's a lot of African dance in my life and drum circles. So okay, three
okay,
words then that
love
would
it.
be artistry,
Mm.
liberation, and love.
Oh, tell me about liberation. I haven't heard that word described.
Liberation.
Yeah,
Oh yeah.
about your childhood. What is the liberation in your childhood? Tell me about it.
Well, I grew up around so many books about liberation for all, Black
Mm,
liberation, equality for all. There was always, if there was something on the radio or television, it was usually like a march or a song. Everything was centered on civil rights and liberation for all people. There was so much visual art in the households
mm,
that spoke to freedom. That was
mm,
like, but even if it was a still image, it was like intensely like arms are out, mouths are open, people are together, and there's so many different colors and bodies,
mm.
and um, just this. There was always this energy of collective liberation, and I grew up around really diverse groups or inclusive groups of friends, lots of different
Yeah.
backgrounds. And uh, just free, all I would feel is this connection to freedom for all
Mm,
of us.
mm.
And learning all of these different traditions, cultural traditions, and what freedom looked like in each household, in
Do you
each
remember what it
culture.
meant for you as a kid, the idea of liberation? Like, was it a concept? Was it a
Ooh,
feeling?
it was a feeling.
Yeah,
It
that's
was
what it
just this
sounds like.
feeling of joy. Yeah, this a community and joy, and everyone just looked so different, and at the same time, we felt the same.
Mm.
Like we were all laughing the same and eating together, and everyone's loving one another. And yeah, I
That's
mean,
powerful.
it's really
Yeah.
powerful.
To have that as a formative
Yeah,
childhood experience must absolutely set the path and narrative for you to be tuned into that.
absolutely. Yeah, I think about when, like sometimes I would come home and talk about somebody from school to my mom, and I think I must have said something about an attraction I had to them, because my mom would say, I think I must have said something like I had a crush on them or something. My mom would always be like, because she would ask me to like kind of describe them, um, and she would be like, "Are they tall? Are they short? Are they, do they have like blue eyes, brown eyes, like long hair, short hair? Are they a boy? Are they a girl? Are they this? Are they that?" But like even gender was thrown in the middle somewhere
Mhm.
in a way where it was like it was just another it was just another
Like,
descriptor.
yeah, it was an
Like it never
attribute.
was a big
Mhm.
deal. Yeah, yeah. And that makes me think about liberation too. Like there was
No
just always
kidding.
this sense, and I didn't even pick up on that when I was younger, but there was just always this sense of like you're free to love however you love who you love. But everybody needs to be free here. And I grew up around my parents speaking up for other people. You know, if jokes
That's
were
important.
made about
Mhm.
any group of people, I always heard both of my parents, whether it was at a restaurant or in a holiday party, like saying, "We don't do that." You know, I don't stand with that.
Wow.
Um, and that was my normal. Yeah.
Yeah. That makes, I mean, this makes a lot of sense for me as I begin to learn you more to know that this is a foundational principle
Yeah.
in your life. But also, what an interesting
Yeah.
juxtaposition to your life as an artist, too, to find liberation in your work, in your voice, in the stories you tell. I'm
Mhm.
curious when, if I were to pull that theme through with you, do you feel like your journey of being more yourself, fully free in the, in exploring these issues is a major through line, not just in childhood, but in your life now?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh my God, it's my lifeline. And it's
Yeah.
what I want for everyone. Like if there was any way I could describe my purpose or
Mm.
desire for the world, is collective liberation.
Mm. I gotta just pause for a second on that one.
Yeah, we could take a time.
Yeah, that would be, I'm even thinking about that for myself. I think that's the stage and place where I'm at in my life. I don't think it was as clear in these terms for me growing up. I think it's something I've come into in my life in the middle passage of my life. And it is, when my husband and
Mm.
and when my husband and I got married, when Felipe and I got married, we, very spiritual, not very religious people. And we kind of crafted our own wedding ceremony. And we pledged to 7 values that we wanted to uphold, that we kind of felt like anchored our life individually and collectively. And the first one was freedom. And I remember telling
Oh,
like an acquaintance, which also is a reminder not to always share your best stuff with people who don't fully know and love you. But I remember telling somebody that
I'm
story.
still learning that.
Yeah, it's that's a tough one. But I remember telling somebody I didn't have a lot of trust built with. I kind of knew peripherally that we were doing that. And she kind of like poo-pooed it, saying, like that's a weird vow for a marriage to vow to be free. And I, had that little bit of shame for a moment where I was like, oh my God, am I doing something wrong? Did I like come up with the wrong word? And then I thought, but individually in our lives, freedom and flexibility and fluidity are the number one value that we want in our life. We want to always be free. And then when we came together as a couple, the framework of our marriage was never about owning one another or the relationship owning each other. It was always about a choosing to be together and a choosing to apply that work to a relationship to build mutually. So I stand by that 100%, but I think I didn't get married till I was 40. I think that is what helped me solidify the idea that freedom, that liberation was an absolute non-negotiable for me and for us as a couple.
Non-negotiable.
Yeah. I've definitely learned not to tell people the good stuff that you're thinking about unless they've really earned that space, you know?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, is not everyone is tapped into their highest self yet.
Yeah.
And with patience on the journey, sometimes we can't share everything that we get from our higher selves with people who aren't tapped into that version. And I think that goes back to the soulmate part, when it's like we just clicked, and it's hard to imagine that we haven't spent that much time in person because we're both tapped in.
Yeah. I think that's
right.
right.
We just get it. And freedom is the foundation of every relationship, I would think. I mean, work relationship, friendships, like each of us has to be free, and we only come together if it brings more liberation.
Agreed.
To us and to the world. Like, that's the beautiful thing I witness about people who find their romantic soulmates, is like them coming together is like, oh my God, that person's purpose needs that other person's purpose. And when they come together, the world is going to be more free. And if it's not that, we don't want it.
Right. So what I know of you, or what I experience of you, Zuri, is that you have this impeccable sort of laser beam focus on some of these things, like the way you're able to share them, articulate them, understand them. What, for just my experience of you, is that you are in relationship to the relationship of yourself, of understanding yourself in the world, and the world in you, and how do you participate. It sounds like a lot of that comes foundationally from your parents and how you were exposed and what you were exposed to and supported in. Did you have struggles in your childhood life, like themes that came up, even with this great foundation, that you still felt like big lessons that you were learning? Because I'm curious, I think if people are listening going, man, I wish I had parents like that, or I wish I had foundation like that. I'm curious, and not that you have to have it, but I'm just curious, out of that, if that's your foundation of understanding, what were some of the lessons you were learning in childhood that really served you, I guess, now in the person you're becoming?
What comes up right now as I hear that question is remembering humanness. Like, I mean, my parents did an incredible job, and also they're so human, they're so many of my lessons came from times when we were butting heads, or so many of the great things that I got through my childhood were from things where they were probably butting heads with their parents and wanted to change the narrative a bit. And so all that to say is that a lot of my lessons came through letting go of people pleasing. My parents, they did this incredible job about like instilling the idea of liberation in me, especially spiritual liberation, and choosing my own path. And also, they held me to such high standards that I had to remember also to make my decisions not to necessarily only make them proud, but also to choose my own, to really choose my own path for me, and not carry any worry about what anyone else would think, especially carrying any worry about seeming selfish. So learning about boundaries with other people, boundaries with self, those have been big ones. And then also what has come up lately, and I think through childhood, has been resentment, letting go of resentment, and learning that resentment doesn't necessarily serve my path. So those are the areas in which I have stumbled a bit. Like I think that the things that kept me sort of, the things that threatened to sort of take me off my path or to slow me down sometimes were from areas where I was people pleasing and doing what I thought were the right things, rather than listening to my own voice. Because I had so much of like, this is the right thing and so much goodness, and just making sure to also, I needed to make sure to tap into my own voice.
Yeah. That's a great point, actually, because I think, you know, learning to listen to the whispers of us in the midst of all of the swirl is, I mean, that's a lifelong lesson. I mean, I'm still working on the ceasing to people please or finding validation in external success and the formulas that we've been given that sometimes tend to think it equals our worth or our value. Selfish was a word that was like kind of a weapon in my childhood. Either things that like I have a more complicated relationship with my mom and things that I'm working through, and that was one that got wielded a lot, and it was something that I had to kind of really dig into and look at. And one of the things that I found was selfish was the Latin origin of the word was little self. Selfish, like the little self. And because I think sometimes, you know, when you establish boundaries, when you learn to have your voice, when you learn to kind of keep your energetic space and also your physical boundaries, people who are used to violating that can get very offended by that, right? And then they're usually tell you you're being selfish or you're being, you know, self-indulgent, or, you know, because you're not being compliant with what they need. And I had that with friendships too. That's been a hard lesson for me. And as soon as I understood the origin of that word, I thought, oh, when I'm learning how to set a boundary, that's my little self saying like, this does not feel good. I do not want this. I do not like this. And like, I now have this relationship where I realize when I'm really struggling with, oh, well, they think I'm selfish, I really have to ask myself, oh, what is my little self needing right now that I'm not doing? Because I'm typically silencing her in those moments.
That's so good. I thought you were going to go with little self being like less conscious. Like you were like, oh, that's the little self. So it's like the less conscious self. But Jess, you just spoke a whole word and said, we need to tap into what the version of me that I need to nurture needs.
Yeah. That's what I'm learning about now is I've got a really small child inside of me with some deeply unmet needs that I'm like learning to listen to and parent. Like, and it is the things like sleeping, resting, saying no, like being creative, playing, loving, like all of the things we do say children deserve, but then we as adults don't often provide that for ourselves or prioritize that.
Well, that, and also, that's good. Also learning that my parents or anybody who I look up to has a little self, and everyone has an inner child, and there are some things that like, oh, their little self doesn't like that, or their little self is triggered by that, and learning how to navigate that too. Either hold space for, or tell myself that like my little self is not responsible for their little self. So let's just take some space. Take some space here. Yeah, that's good.
In
and
your
everyone
childhood
is,
or in your,
everyone is selfish.
I
Like
would hope
selfishness
so.
is not necessarily a bad thing.
I don't think so. I'm switching my
Yeah.
my relationship to that because I think we've used it much in the same way we kind of turn a lot of what can be powerful, like being decisive is intentional, being you know, ambitious. We always talk about that in a negative way. I think sometimes when you're selfish, that we all talk about self-care right now. And I'm like, at the core of that is learning to care for you before you can care for anybody else or anything else.
Yes.
Because I am a definite example of trying to give from an empty well, and it doesn't work. You know?
Yeah. Same.
I was curious. I figured we might be the same there. I was curious as you were experiencing your childhood and your adolescence, and I want to talk about your education as well, but I wanted to know if you had in your formative years, did you have loss? Did you lose people that you loved? Have death in your life as a young person, and what was that like? Did you talk about that with your family? I'm curious how they handled that topic.
Yeah, that's a great question. I witnessed a lot of death, starting pretty early in my childhood.
Really?
Some of my members, which also my father had sickle cell anemia, and then other family members did as well, who died. And yeah, there were also different health things. You know, I had an aunt who I had another aunt who had a heart attack, grandmother who had a heart attack. I saw a lot of dead bodies. I went to a lot of funerals from a young age. All of my grandparents, with the exception of my stepmom's parents, had died pretty early in my life.
Wow.
And then also in Palo Alto, I experienced a lot of friends who committed suicide. So unfortunately, really, I mean,
in high school,
so much so that even in high school, in high school, high school and middle school, there was, for lack of a better word, a trend of my peers committing suicide, claiming due to some sort to stress and overwhelm. There was a lot of academic pressure in that area. So much so that I think I became desensitized to suicide, as like as a response to stress, you know, like that it happened quite a lot. Yeah, it happened quite a lot. So yeah, I mean, and then I did witness more death later in college. I witnessed a lot of death, and then most recently my father's passing.
Yeah.
I think because I had experienced so much death, I thought that I would be prepared in a way emotionally to process a parent passing. And it's a totally different type of grief. It's a totally different type of grief. And the conversations, you know, growing up as an only child, I didn't have a fellow peer to sort of talk through those things with. And so I journaled a lot. My dad bought me a lot of journals. He was a writer, and he encouraged me to journal. We didn't really have conversations. Like we didn't have, and I'm still not fully sure why. We didn't have a lot of like the deep emotional conversations. That's just not really where he was. But he expressed a lot in his writing, and he wanted me to do the same. And that's where I got a lot out. So I'm honestly still learning to talk through difficult things with people.
Yeah. When you say witness death, do you mean, just so that I know, so I'm not assuming, do you mean that you've seen people die?
When I said it in that context, I haven't. Oh, I meant that I've experienced a lot of people dying, but I haven't always been in the room with the people who have died.
Got it. Yeah, it's such an interesting thing. When I also had a lot of death in my life as a young person. Many of it, one of it was a murder. A pretty prominent murder happened to somebody that I loved, my first love, actually. When I was 13 and he was 16, and that was very tragic and traumatic. And then I've had friends who have committed suicide. And you're right. I think there's something when you're younger too, because you're at that beginning stage and place of your life. I think we're always assuming we've got all this time. And then when somebody your age dies for whatever reason, it can either desensitize it a little bit because you're kind of like, this doesn't, it doesn't connect or compute in some way. Or I think for me, I internalized it so much that I had this tremendous fear of dying. And obviously I think a lot of us do, because we walk around pretending it's never going to happen to us, and we just don't know when it's going to happen. And there was like this denial for me as a young person about death. Like we'd have the funeral and the ritual, but I didn't understand the full like essence of it either. I think, I didn't really, and maybe sometimes we try to protect kids from that, but I think about the kids, I mean, that are growing up now who are on active shooter drills at school and who everyday violence is more common than before. And I think we owe us a conversation to kind of demystify death and dying, because we will all die anyway. Like all of us die. We're all born and we're all dying.
Yeah.
There's just, I don't know any other, those are the ways our stories are the same. Everything else could be different, but we have the same beginning and the same ending.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, there's I recently, at the beginning of January, there was a college classmate of mine who died really unexpectedly. And that's where I started to shift. I think because when I was younger, I had experienced so many family members dying through physical sickness. And at that time, I didn't have an understanding of the systemic racism in the healthcare system and all of that, and or socioeconomic system that led to the physical issues. But what I knew was that people were getting physically sick and dying, or in high school, people were feeling severely overwhelmed in their homes and at school and choosing to end their life. Right. And then with my classmate Najee, one of my college classmates, Najee, he had just celebrated his 30th birthday. And then on January 7th, he had a seizure at work, and he had never had a seizure before, and he died. And
oh my gosh,
that was where, and I was flying to New York to see my dad after I'd gone to Ghana, and Najee lived in New York. And it was also a blessing that I was able to be a part of that ceremony to bury him. But I say all that to say that was my first time where I processed that it wasn't from it wasn't from like a sickness that had been going on, and he didn't choose to take his life. Right. So then I was completely thrown off guard in that sense. Like I didn't understand that death could happen in that context, in a way that like I just wasn't prepared for. And then I started to really, through therapy, honestly, have conversations with my therapist about death and about what it means to start becoming an ancestor, and the graduation that it is, and the fact that no matter what, someone has completed their purpose here in this realm and is being taken to another realm. And that's why police brutality has absolutely no power over us. And we will continue to fight to end it. But what the enemies don't know is that they're literally sending us to the next realm, to heaven. Like, now we're going to watch over and be your ancestors. So all of that, where was like, ooh, I just went on a rant. But I
was
mean,
going with you wherever
when Najee
you were
died when Najee died in January, that really allowed me to process death in a new way. Like the shock of death was different. It felt like I had as many people as I had made peace with, their death before. This felt, when Najee died, it was like you would have thought my grief. I would have thought I'd never experienced somebody dying before, because I was in so much shock. And I think that prepared me, honestly, for my father's passing as well.
Which is so uncanny to think that January 7th, while that happens to your friend from college, that months later you're going to be facing, because your father's death was not sudden. What was it, sudden? Or, I mean, I know he had sickle cell, but tell me, like, that wasn't expected necessarily.
It wasn't expected. No. I mean, he had sickle cell. He lived, I would say, probably, he was 66, and he wasn't expected to live past 20, with sickle cell.
Really?
Yeah. So I always had in my mind, I'll need to prepare myself. However, he's just so active, so vibrant. More and more research has come up now to cure young patients who have sickle cell. So there have been more innovations. I've had more hope, and also my dad's been around for so long,
I
considering with
know.
sickle cell, that
Yeah.
there wasn't really a full way to be prepared.
No.
And also, he was who took me to Najee's funeral. We spent that time together in New York, and that January, that was the last time I was with my dad physically in person.
Right. Right. Because you've been
Was
here in
that
LA,
time?
and
Yeah,
um
yeah.
I mean, this is also the most I mean, there's never a good time to lose a loved one. This is an exceptionally difficult
No,
space because of the
yeah.
prohibition of seeing people in hospitals right now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's the thing. So like it wasn't sudden, but he had a most recent sickle cell crisis that sent him into the hospital, which is a normal thing. Usually he
Yep.
gets, treated and he'll be out in a couple days. And this time just it just also sent him into pneumonia, which sent him to the ICU. And also, I think physically, no family could be with him. I think that
Yeah,
has an effect on someone's experience in the hospital. And
I do
while
too.
I trust it all the way, I just, I
Yeah.
do think about that was
Oh
his
yeah.
experience this time. And this time he
Yes.
made his transition.
Remember when
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
posted or you shared the picture of outside of his hospital room, that light? Remember
Hmm.
there was all this, and this is the thing that I appreciate about you a lot, is even in the throes of, of despair and of sadness and of fear of all these things that were going on,
Yeah.
you're still able to find the sign, to find the universe talking to you, to
Hmm.
sign the connection to spirit, where it makes you feel less alone, doesn't it? If you can tune into those.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's my means of survival, that faith and that knowing that he's really there's something about when he was in the hospital. He was in the hospital for several weeks. My dad loves to sit in the sun. My dad loves sunlight and light. So that sun shining in on his room was such a symbol of the grace that is on him that he's given to so many. And also, because I stayed in LA, was here, could not go and be with him in the
Yeah.
hospital, I sat outside for hours every single day on my
Mm.
patio, and I've felt closer to him than ever before. I just felt him so with me.
Yeah. What kind of things did your dad leave you in legacy? Because you posted all these beautiful images of him. First of all, like physically resembling and beautiful, but the beautiful connection between the two of you, it was palpable just to see that
Hmm.
in imagery. And I think some of the things that you shared more
Hmm.
publicly, like texts that he had sent you and the way that he looked at the honor of being your daddy, also was so powerful.
Hmm.
What kind of legacy do you think he
Yeah.
planted in you, Zuri?
Oh, he definitely planted in me to treat people well,
Mm.
compassion for all, to remember the oneness of all
Mhm.
people. That's a big one that he's planted in me. Just the importance of staying connected with family, family as in community, like friends, blood
Yeah.
related. Yeah, love, deep love. I mean, that's so important to him. When the quarantine started, and he was just getting used to a lot of different technology, so he was starting to perform his poetry via Zoom and stuff in concerts.
Oh,
But
wow.
another thing that he would do, yeah, and another thing that he would do, he finally started to really love FaceTime. He would FaceTime me twice a day, and he was doing that with a lot of family. So I would say connection with loved
Mhm.
ones. And certainly he always taught me, to treat people well. He was very big on tipping people, giving gifts to people, handwritten gifts, handwritten thank you notes to
Mhm.
everyone, looking people in the eyes. And
Mhm.
yeah, he was big on that, big on gratitude, big on love, and big on the oneness, not separating based on any perceived differences.
Mm. What a gift he is and was and will be to all of the future people that he gets to impact from where he is right now. Um, the
Yeah.
picture that I
And
saw.
artistry. artistry.
Oh yeah, I was going to ask you. Well, I was supposed to ask you about that. Was some of the pictures that I saw that you posted? So he was a poet, amongst other things, right? Well, tell me about his writing and what he liked to write in the world.
Oh yeah, a lot of his poetry. I think that's the way that he expressed a lot of what he was experiencing, especially through his health.
Mm,
He wrote a lot of very rhythmic, performative poetry, and he would perform it all over Brooklyn. And also, he was an educator in the New York public school system. So he taught English, language arts, and social studies as well.
amazing.
And he would have reading lists. I mean, I had a whole curriculum at home after school. He was making sure that, yeah, he was, and he would teach his students. Like some of their field trips would be to go to a nice restaurant so they could use like cloth napkins and learn how to
Mm,
tip and all that stuff. Students who weren't getting that experience.
yeah.
And for me, even like the books that he would have me read, there it would always be books with like a young Black girl in them, you know, something where I could see myself. He was making sure I was seeing myself in my literature in ways that I wasn't
Mm.
necessarily in my school curriculum. Um, Dang, what was your question? Did I
Oh my
answer
gosh,
it?
I don't know, but I'm just literally just thanking God for Daryl
Oh, his
like right
writing.
now. His writing. Well, and also I was thinking
So
like
great. Yeah.
this is not even again, this quote has come up a number of times in these podcasts, but coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. But it's not a
Mm.
coincidence that
Ooh, that's good.
I know it's so good. It's so good to think about that. But then I think about what you're doing now in your world and how you playing Malika are becoming the character that your father wished you would have seen as a girl, right?
Oh my God, I didn't think about that. That's good.
Like I feel like that I feel
That's
like,
good.
that's the stuff that again is not coincidence, but it all comes together because there's the intentionality again. He brought you the visions as a little girl so that you could play Malika at this point now. That's how I feel anyway. I think all of it was
Mhm.
destined and ordained.
That's so true. And he was making sure that I was watching things where I would see myself too.
Yeah.
Yeah, both in theater and on screen.
I think about that as a
And
legacy.
my dad was an actor, he's also acting. He was doing a lot of theater. Yeah, and he really supported himself. Like his job was at the age of 8. So the fact that and he made sure that I that wasn't my experience. Like my dad supported his family, his mom and his sister quite a lot. He helped with the household. And I do know that, you know, economically, that's part of why he didn't fully pursue his acting career, because he needed more financial stability and he needed to support himself. And my dad really, really supported me and supported my
Mm,
dreams. I mean, through college and after college, he was just so adamant about making sure that I stayed on my path. You know, if I was ever in a
mm.
bind, he helped me out, whether it was just simply emotionally or financially. He was just always like giving up was never the option. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I do feel like I'm carrying all of our dreams in many
Mhm.
ways. Yeah.
And what an opportunity to pay homage to the value system that he raised you in and the things that you were
Oh yeah.
able to pay attention to at a young age that now you get to live into as an adult woman. I saw a picture of you guys. I think it was maybe at your graduation. I'm sure he was incredibly proud of your
Mm-hmm.
educational path. And I wanted to talk about that because you went to Spelman, right, for your undergrad, and
Mm-hmm.
then you did your master's at
Yeah.
UCLA. But you have a very specific connection to HCBUs, right?
Yeah.
HBCUs.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
I want to talk about the legacy now that you're doing in the education space as well, coming from two educators. Talk to me a little bit about the Spelman experience and then this scholarship fund that you set up. It's with UCLA, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Spelman was the best decision I've ever made in my entire life. Um, Going to an HBCU, historically Black college and university, is this opportunity to learn learn about oneself in this empowering way, because we get to learn history through, like, well before American history, and learn Black history well before slavery. I mean, all of the innovations that we were making in the African diaspora, the royalty that we were across the African diaspora, and then, you know, and then learning, of course, about the slave trade and the various parts of the slave trade. And not just that, though. I mean, I got to learn my specific craft as a theater student through the lens of so many writers of color. Everything was through the lens and perspective of the oppressed. And it's so empowering to have that knowledge and education, and to walk into every room I enter in with that knowledge of who we really are. Because I learned things and I had a great public school education in Palo Alto. Though there's so much about my history that I didn't start learning until I went to Spelman. And that is the case at every HBCU. And what's beautiful about Spelman is that it's a women's college. So there's so much that was learned about feminism and Black feminism and women's contributions to the civil rights movement. And one of the first books that we all have to read, first class we all have to take, is called African Diaspora and the World. So we learn so much about how what we learned before was from a westernized perspective, and we learn to dismantle that. And then we learn our craft. Once we go into our majors, we get to learn our craft through that perspective. It's so empowering. And then the other thing I would say is that I got to the way I grew up in Palo Alto was, it was so different from Spelman, because at Spelman I got to be maybe the theater person, but I wasn't the Black person. I wasn't the Black girl. I didn't have to represent a whole group of people. I just got to be like this theater girl. And you know, one of my roommates is studying psychology, another one's studying Japanese, and really is someone else really into anime, someone else, you know, like I just got to be Zuri. And to have 4 years of just being Zuri, in a world that doesn't always, or in systems that work against that, was so empowering. And then taking that to my graduate school education, I'm so glad that I had that as a foundation before stepping into my MFA program at UCLA. And at UCLA, we started a scholarship specifically for graduates of HBCUs who are pursuing their Master's in Fine Arts in theater, film, or television, whether it's performance, directing, writing, producing, digital media, because that perspective is so unique, that it's just like this internal self-empowerment, this knowledge. It's really important in the discussions that we have in the MFA program about the art that we're going to create together. And I wanted more. There were so many HBCU students who would come to visit UCLA, and they were getting full scholarships from Yale. They were getting full scholarships from other schools that were able to offer them that package. And UCLA wasn't able to offer them that financial package. And I really wanted their voice to be at UCLA. And they liked UCLA more because of the way that UCLA was incorporating digital media and new technologies in storytelling. And they would choose to go to other schools because they were getting larger scholarships. And I understood that. And also I wanted to start to change that. So the scholarship is something that I really called on community and friends. I mean, while still paying off my student loans for UCLA, was just like, hey, friends who had gone to HBCUs and had their MFAs. And then also just anybody who was passionate about artistry and education. We just all put in, we created a link at UCLA, and the dean at UCLA of UCLA School of Theater, Film, and Television was super supportive. And we just started a fund to be able to give, it started with be able to fund books or be able to help with what a rent or just anything, like a pool of money to help an HBCU graduate who was pursuing their MFA at UCLA. And it continues now, and it's getting bigger and bigger.
That's amazing.
And I want to take it to more MFA programs. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's amazing.
I love that. Well, there's so many themes in our conversation today, the intentionality being one, the gifts of legacy being another, like the foundational values that we hold dear in your family, the way you've been raised, the way you've experienced the world, the give back and the education. But the way that you were describing your experience at Spelman, was, in my experience, what I was relating it to was single sex education, and the way that when women are educated, you also had that opportunity at Spelman as well. And thinking about all of the arguments that I haven't had that benefit of having that kind of education. I've really had to seek out my communities within the educational worlds to, my whole world broke open when I took women's studies in college because it gave me a framework. But I look back now and it didn't give me as intersectional a framework as I really need to be a productive person in this world. And so when I hear you talk about the dismantling of history and the way we've been taught in our schools, it's become more and more and more apparent to me. And now as I teach, I'm a professor at USC, and I see how much the canon of literature we have is limited, how the canon of experience we have is limited, how we shape minds and we shape lives by telling everybody a portion of the truth and a portion and a point of view that was never, ever written by women, let alone Black women, African women, so it's really, I look at how that may be playing out now in this world. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that a little bit, just because, there's a lot of, like Rachel Cargill calls, a lot of unlearning happening right now. Right. And a call to unlearn what has been learned by people, especially white people and people in privileged positions. And so I'm curious, like, coming from the educational background you have, looking at the way that you're passionate about the dismantling, how are you seeing all of these sort of like elevated now conversations that we're having about the need to learn, and then the reality of what it takes to actually unlearn something?
Ooh, do you mean the conversations like right now
About race and about
since George
racism?
Floyd's death, or like,
Yeah. I'm talking about like the systemic
yeah,
racism. You've got a lot of, like, at least my perception is a lot of people are like, and read this book and here's this resource and here's all these things. And so we're having a conversation, which is important, right?
yeah,
About education, but it is an unlearning as much as it is an education, right? It's how to critically think about the things that you're going to be reading, and entering into a relationship of dismantling is different. It's different than just reading a book and taking it at face value. We're asking people to
yeah.
be critically thinking. So I was curious, in your point of view, how you're experiencing the rise of that conversation, and what your thinking is about seeing all of it. Because I have my own feelings about, it's great to say it, we have to do it, and those are two different things.
Yeah. Yeah. So two things. This is where the resentment is coming up for me, because I'm saying to myself, what's different this time that now people
Yeah.
want to say Black Lives Matter? People want to take a knee and understand taking a knee. Is it that we're home and we have more time? All the different things, and then also being like, okay, well, we're doing it now, let's do it. And I also see a lot of performative allyship, performative work on social media, because now we have social media. We're able to quickly put up a Black square. We're able to recommend certain books. We're able to tell each other what we're doing wrong and what we need and what we don't need, and then go back to whatever we're doing at home.
Right.
So when I really when I really hear the whisper, what the whisper says is that this is a time when we need to do, no matter what book we read, no matter what movie we watch, it's really a time of going within and connecting to that oneness where we are really all one. And everybody needs to get in tune with their inner voice, their highest voice, because we are so susceptible to different opinions and what allyship looks like, or what activism looks like.
Yeah.
What we need to do is tap into that truth voice, because that's how we can sit in a meeting and say, oh, we need more representation in this way, or, oh, actually, that's a harmful thing to say. Here's a different way we can say it. Or at holidays, you know, we need to be able to tap in and say, oh, that's actually not in alignment with liberation for all. Here's what is. And and that's really where the changes can really, really, really happen.
Yeah.
And in order for us to do that, sure, books, but before reading the books, before learning the history, we have to declutter any voice that's not our own. And honestly, the people who are out here murdering folks need to do the same, because they have voices in their heads that are telling them that one group of human beings deserves to die for the perceived socioeconomic advancement of their group of human beings.
That's right.
And it's so deeply rooted that we have to declutter those voices and get closer to our voice. So if that's meditation twice a day, if that's prayer, if that's books, if that's time away from social media, if that's time on social media. But first it's just like, you gotta clean the house before you can put new furniture in, you know. That's you gotta take the old stuff out. Yeah, you gotta clean up the floors. Like, there's a lot of internal work that happens, and it takes longer.
I was going to say, and in some cases, you also have to just sometimes burn that whole house down. Like, there are systems, you know, like sometimes, you know, you have to take a house to its studs and rebuild it again.
Yeah.
Because it won't be able to contain what we want to, you know, what we want to build. Yeah. I feel like I've wanted and have felt very, very called to be more quiet during this time, which has been, I've been watching, you know, like everybody on social media. We talked about all the good parts of the connective tissue of social media. And then this becomes the part where we perform our lives anyway on social media. And then to perform allyship or activism can get you that dopamine hit of like, oh, I've connected. I've said it, like, check the box. I did it. And then the learning, nobody's going to see that shit. Like, you have to still do that stuff. Like, you know, no one's grading you. That's what I want to say to fellow white people, quite honestly. It's like, this is a marathon and not a sprint. And it's a marathon we should have been running quite some time ago. But like, the urgency, I understand, because it's, you know, but it is also, I want it to be a rooted, grounded urgency of long-lasting change, instead of, let me just make sure everybody feels that I'm okay right now. Because I don't know. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And anti-racism is lifelong work. You know, liberation for all is lifelong work. It's not, you can't do it in a post. And that's for everyone. I mean, we are all just exhausted, traumatized over and over again. And it is important, like, self-care really is, Alex L. said this, she said, self-care is community care. So whatever, and the fact that you're tapped into that voice that's telling you where to be more quiet and where to be more active, like, that's what I want for everyone, to be that in tune with that voice, because that's where the real change can happen, because we all have such a unique purpose and we all have something very specific to give. Some of that is on the ground and on the front lines, and some of that is not. We all need each other. The people on the front lines need the people who are not on the front lines.
That's right.
In order to uplift them, to keep them fed well, to, you know, all of that, to keep them spiritually lifted. Like, and I'm doing a little bit of both. So I'm learning a little bit about all of it. And each thing, each task that I take on it has to be spirit led.
Yeah. I think that's an important thing for people. There have been a lot of diagrams that I've seen online of systemic change models and the roles that everybody can play in this part. And that's what I'm hoping that specifically white allies will consider is that this is not about getting a cookie or a grade. This is not about being applauded for whatever light bulbs are going off for you. In fact, none of this is actually about us. And I mean, from an accountability standpoint, I would like in all self-work, all of it, including the dismantling of sexism, homophobia, racism, all of the institutionalized ways that we have been designed to stay separate from each other and to be kept under order, requires you to do some deep work at looking at where you've benefited and where you break that contract and what are the repercussions of breaking that contract. Like none of this work, I think also, even when you do self-work, when you're trying to change a pattern in your life that you've had over and over and over again, you have to reckon with what you actually get from that pattern before you can let it go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's time for inner work. And even though, and it's that makes it a long game.
Yeah.
And it's worth it. It's worth the time that it takes. Yeah.
Yeah. So you guys you had to stop down shooting for Good Trouble, right? With everybody else.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I can't wait to see what picks up in the world that you're in.
I know.
Right? Your writers are probably going bananas right now.
I know. Because they're all still working. So I know they're writing some.
Oh, yeah.
I know they're writing some.
I mean, there's no way they can't. And your character in particular is going to have, I just can't wait to see where you get to go with her. But will you talk a little bit about what Malika has brought to your life as a role, like what you've grown from in playing her and playing with her out in the world?
Yes. Malika is such a blessing. She's such a blessing. I always say, I think activism chose me. Like I never sought it. And although in the household I grew up in with the books and then Spelman and the education that I received there, it's always been with me, this idea of liberation. And then with Malika, with all the different doors that closed and the door that opened to Malika, she's such a spiritual assignment for me, my greatest one. And what I learned the most, honestly, is really the power of the purpose of being on the front lines. When it comes to activism, the work that it takes, and also the joy that's required to do it. When I was, in my forms of activism before were more so with having conversations, starting the scholarships, doing, being parts of wellness groups that created more accessibility to people of color, making sure that marginalized people can be well and pour in. That was where I was doing more of the work. And Malika is protesting. She is with Black Lives Matter LA. She is on the front lines. She's confronting people of authority, judges and cops and all that. And I'm learning to, I guess with my social anxiety, I never did well in big crowds. Like I can't even go to Costco, people moving in different directions. So protest always felt really intense to me, really intense. And because I got to do it on a film set where I know that the cops are part of, I know that the cops are being directed. I know the guns are not real. I know that somebody's saying action and all that.
Yeah.
It was a great way to feel the sacred energy of that type of environment. And to get to know Patrisse and Melina, who inspired my storyline, to get to know them and the work that they do, the heavy work that they do, and to meet families who have lost loved ones to police violence through Good Trouble. I've met so many families and spoken with so many families. I've gotten to I've gotten a really up close, view on what it is. And because now I am somewhat of a face of the activism, I feel really honored to participate on the front lines now with Patrisse at protests, and to feel just the collective. It's like it can be like church. I mean, there's so much danger around it. You know, cops are swarming around unfairly, and pointing guns and shooting and taking out tear gas. And there's so much physical proximity.
Yeah.
It's certainly not the only way to be an activist. But in those moments where we're chanting together that our lives matter, there is this sense of just like, it feels like church, like we are collectively working towards something together and we will not stop. And Good Trouble and the activism that I get to portray on screen has really given me a firsthand reminder of how important it is to do this work. And then, yeah, I would. And the other thing that I would say.
Oh, no, sorry. I just want to interrupt Zuri one second to make sure that people knowing the Patrisse that you're talking about is Patrisse Cullors, right? Who is co-founder, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter. And I just wanted people to make sure they connect the dots on that.
Exactly. Yeah. Patrisse Cullors. Oh my gosh. She's incredible. And she wrote a book called When They Call You a Terrorist. Yeah. And if anyone is looking for a great book to read about activism, that's a phenomenal one. And what I love about Patrisse and Dr. Melina Abdullah, who is also one of the leaders of Black Lives Matter LA, anytime I'm around them, I mean, they're dealing with such heavy stuff. They are constantly being called by different families who are processing so much trauma. They have families of their own. They're on the front lines. They're organizing, and they also have so much joy. I mean, they're still talking about all type, they're like, girl, da, 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 and they're just laughing so hard with each other and carrying so much weight. And I've learned that we can have both, you know, we can fight for our freedom, and we can laugh, we can love, we can, and they are very connected to the oneness. Like, they are all about Black Lives Matter, and they were able to do so without any homophobia, without any, I mean, it is a queer-led organization. And it is an organization that says we all need to fight this fight together. I mean, there are just so many different people with so many different backgrounds in the movement, and they are the leaders of it. And joyfully, I mean, they just love on the way that they love on everybody like their family is something that I've learned through observing them. I mean, because of Good Trouble. Yeah. Because Good Trouble brought them into my life. Yeah.
I think that's an important takeaway for people who are either just discovering their activism or have been longtime activists. And we all know that those of us who fight systemic injustice on whatever level we do, corporately, educational system, health system, all of the systems, burnout is real, and the effect of feeling hopeless, especially at times where the stories are mounting and the injustice seems unstoppable. And the fact that you could claim joy is a beautiful act of resistance and of revolution, and the happiness and the oneness. And when we started this conversation, I don't think we were rolling yet, but when I inquired about how you are, which is definitely a loaded question these days, your answer was, I feel gratitude. And I that fills my heart up to hear that back in so many ways, because I think it's just a reminder for all of us that this is, God willing, for the time that we have above ground walking in this world, we have choices that we can make about how we engage in the life that we lead. And that's why I wanted to do this program, because loss is inevitable, and the loss of a loved one is inevitable. And our loss ultimately is inevitable. And how we learn how to handle it with dignity, with grace, with compassion, but also not to forget the joy, not to forget what it feels good to feel being alive, even in the work, is very powerful. And I don't believe that's a net sum game. I think they can coexist. And in fact, they need to coexist for our own health and well-being too.
It's the only way. It's the only way we can do this work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, going on that theme, I talk a lot about urgently living on this program because, and I don't mean urgent in the traditional like rise and grind hustle kind of way where it's all about like urgently trying to perform the act, but more about what lights you up for living now, like what you're urgently trying to manifest, create, engage with in your life? Like, what is like urgent for you right now, Zuri?
Oh my God, I love that. Ooh, what's urgent for me? Joy and love. Joy and love. I want to experience joy and love every day. I want to laugh at some point every day. I want to dance and I want to move my body. I just want to feel liberation every single day, even while crying, even while deeply grieving. I want to love on the people I love. I mean, I'm really realizing that is what we have. That's, once at some point we're all gonna die anyway. We're all gonna leave these physical bodies.
Yes.
This is the vessel we were given by God for a specific reason, to tell the stories that we can tell through these voices and bodies. Sure. And then what after that, we transcend to all being exactly the same. And what we get to leave on this earth is the love that we put out through these vessels. And I want to put out as much love and receive as much genuine love as I can. That's what's urgent for me. Yeah, love.
Received.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is I knew that this conversation would light me up and make me feel happy. I didn't know how much, and I feel it all the way to my tippy toes. Like I value your being on this planet. I'm so grateful. What's your mom's name, by the way?
Elaine.
Elaine and Daryl, thank you for creating Zuri and Spirit Above. And just, I get excited about your career of purposefulness and intention. I mean, not only are you incredibly talented, for me, that's like an underscore of all of this. You've got the chops. That's like not even in contention, but like the humanity, the humility, the curiosity, the creativity, the generosity that you have as a person, Zuri, like, that's what I clicked into with you. That's what makes me so excited to support anything and everything that you do in the world, and to hold the space for hopefully more conversations like this, where we can talk about the loss, the grief, the passions and the purpose, but ultimately the love and the joy that we get to choose while we're here, because it can be a choice. It is a choice in so many ways. And I'm just so grateful for you.
I'm so grateful for you. You bring me so much joy, so much love every day. Yeah.
Ditto. I hold you tight. I'm happy that we got to have this in beautiful divine timing. And I hope
My God.
maybe as I know, in almost like too divine timing, but
Yes.
maybe as we release this out in the world, and we hear how people respond to this conversation, people might have more questions. Would you come back on and talk to me again, and we can maybe answer some people's questions? Because the one part we didn't get into that I want to next time is your rituals and your practices and the way that
burn my sage.
Yes, I did that this morning. And the things that you do to maintain that. I'd like to do this. Maybe we'll do this as a part 2 the next time, which is like how to manifest this this clarity that you're creating. Because I think people who are listening, and certainly fans of yours and people who follow you, know that there's a discipline too in creating that joy and space in your life.
Daily. And more than daily. I mean, minute to minute.
Moment to moment. I
Moment to
love it.
moment.
I
would
love that you're
love to talk
saging.
about that.
Give me some of that sage over here.
Yes, honey. Listen, we all need it.
Oh, I love you dearly, friend. Thank you for coming on with me.
Yes, and I'll be back.
I can't wait. Well, I guess if we were going to pick one word that summarizes that conversation, it would be that word intentional. You've heard us use it quite a bit in the conversation, but I wanted to break down a little bit what that word really means to me and why I find it so important, especially for a conversation around death and loss and living. Intentionality for me is really about thoughtfulness. It is about being thoughtful about your actions. It is asking why. It is asking how will this impact. It is thinking about what will I get and what will I give from this interaction around anything. It could be your intentionality about showing up for work, for your friends, in raising kids, like we heard with Zuri's parents. They had an intentional way to raise her steeped in education and conversation around liberation for all. Like, if we could just dial into some of our own personal value systems, we can come up with what our intentionality is, what we want to sort of focus on out in the world in our engagement and our relationships. That's really important for me because it has accountability to it. And so it's one of the reasons why I love talking to Zuri. She is an accountable friend. She's a very beautiful boundaried friend. And so I love people like that because you know where you stand with boundaries. And when they're healthy and loving and kind, it makes relationships, I find, a lot easier. But I also knew that Zuri has experienced this incredible loss of her dad, Daryl, just recently. And, we were waiting for this right time to do this conversation. I didn't want to push her, gave her, time for it to feel right for her. And I just think she did Daddy Daryl very proud in this conversation around just showing up, being exactly who she is, that thoughtful, kind, inquisitive, loving person. And maybe the biggest thing I'll take away at the end of our conversation was her urgency for joy and love. Joy and love. Can you imagine what it might feel like in your life if we just had more intentionality and more urgency towards love and towards feeling joy and sharing joy? What would our world look like? What would our relationships look like? What would our work look like? What would we feel like if we all latched on to that urgency? That's what I'm leaving this conversation with today. It's something I was hoping to get to in these podcasts is really the joyful part of all the elements of living, even the really tough, yucky stuff. And we are living through some incredibly horrible times right now. And I love that even in all of that, she could grasp onto the joy and we can grasp onto the joy. So I'm curious to hear what you think about all of this, especially if you've lost a parent. I'd be welcoming your experience and wanting to understand what legacy your parents have left for you and planted in you in your life. If you're willing to share that, I'd love to hear it. But if you have more questions for Zuri, we didn't get into her amazing rituals or routines, which I want to bring her back on to talk about because there is a structure that she has towards joyful living that I think is really important. So we will get into that in a part 2 of this conversation. So send me any questions or ideas or thoughts to podcast@jessweiner.com and I'll include them in the next episode with her. Thank you as always so much for going on this ride with me. I'll see you soon. You've been listening to We're All Gonna Die Anyway with me, Jess Weiner. You can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And you can also watch this podcast by checking out my YouTube channel for filmed episodes, behind the scenes footage, and all other kinds of amazing video goodies. And of course, you can always visit me at jessweiner.com. We're All Gonna Die Anyway is exec produced by me and produced by Lauren Chavez Myers. Our episodes are recorded, filmed, and edited by Jeff Franklin and Adam Lippert of B Film. And our original amazing music is by Becca and Destiny Petrell. As always, I want to send a special thank you to the love of my life, the amor de mi vida, Felipe Lopez. And if you love this podcast, please make sure to tell your friends, subscribe, and leave a review at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. Most importantly, if there is something that stood out to you from today's episode, I want to hear about it. So if you want to share your own story, leave a comment, ask a question, please send me an email at podcast@jessweiner.com. I can't wait to hear from you. Bye, babies.